PhD program with me, Tony Brown, and as usual, I have with me Tom Donovan. Tommy, welcome along anyway to the program.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony.
And this is from the Limerick Historical Society, where I said I keep forgetting to say that we're often looking for us. Well, we are always looking for members to join up, and we hope that people will join up if they see these recordings. This is about the 38th or 39th one we've done now, and most interesting. There'll be good record for the, I suppose, in future times. They'll be good to look back on. Now tonight we're changing a different subject, and tonight we have with us Tomás McNamara. Tomás, first of all, you're welcome along to the program anyway.
Thanks very much, Tony. Thank you, Tom.
And we'll talk about your book in a few minutes, and we'll get around to that and when it was published and the price of it and where it can be got and that. We'll talk about that. But first of all, just to ask you, because it's unusual to get people, let's say so young, involved in local history, and what got you involved in local history?
Yeah, no problem. I'm not as young as I used to be. When people used to say that about me, but I don't know if they can say it anymore. But look, I was interested in history from a very, very young age. I was interested in the past, I suppose. Even from the age of 8 or 9, for whatever reason, I'd always be kind of picking up old bottles or, you know, old objects. I just had some interest in the past. I can't really explain it other than that was kind of like a feeling that I just, you know, liked. I was attracted to the past. I was enchanted by it. But I do know that one of the biggest formations or influences on me was my neighbour out in Ballymalone, the townland of Ballymalone in Tumgraney. My neighbour called Jim McNamara, who was born in 1908 up in Killanena, and who would have moved down to Tumgraney, I suppose, in the 40s, and eventually married his wife Sarah. But from the age of about 8, I would have been up and down to Jim. You know, we were in a mountain town and we were the last house up the top of the mountain, and Jim was the next to us, maybe half a mile away. And I'd been up and down to Jim a lot, especially after his wife died when I was about 13. I would have been down to him almost every day until I kind of reached my early 20s and I moved out of home. And after that, I would have, anytime I was back home, and I would have been home quite regularly, from Innis or wherever I'd be living in Limerick, I would always be down with Jim, and I'd be hours below with him. And, you know, he wasn't trying to tell me about the past. He wasn't one of these people, and I've met many of them now over my life. He wasn't trying to kind of talk about history or, you know, tell me about the importance of history. He just was a kind of an embodiment of it. His speech, the words he used, the way he spoke, his kind of mannerisms, you know, the traditions that he adhered to, you know, sometimes even subconsciously, like they were all rooted in history, rooted in place. And he had this profound understanding of his place. And you know, one of the things that really, you know, it forced itself on me was how valuable he was, you know, as a source of information and a source of knowledge. And despite the fact that he couldn't read, that he couldn't write, that he would have only gone into Limerick the odd time and other than that stayed in his own place, you know, he's one of the wisest people I've ever met. And I've met many academics and I've met many doctors of this and doctors of that. And even though I've gone on to do a PhD myself, like I very, very clearly understand that there's no correlation at all necessarily between education and intelligence. And it's a failure of our society that we put so much stock in formal education, you know, and there's a lot of people I've met who are very, very educated, but I would argue they're not very, very intelligent. But really for those, that union, let's say, of history and older people, for me, was very, very strong right from a young age. And from the age of 13 or so, 14, I started writing things down in a notebook, and, you know, just the old words he'd say, or maybe a story or two that he'd tell me. And, you know, I a couple of years after that, I bought a dictaphone and I started recording people. My father would go to visit. My father was from O'Callaghan's Mills, the bed of heaven to him. He was from O'Callaghan's Mills, and he used to love going visiting his old friends and neighbours too. Not really to talk about history, well, although they would, but he was more just interested in the social thing. But I'd go with him and I'd be writing down notes and words and stuff that were being said. And then I started recording it. And I suppose from the age of 17, 18, I really started to kind of interview older people. And that continues now, and I'm very, very grateful to be able to work professionally as a heritage consultant and to be working on oral history projects around the country.
And have any of the words that he used to use, Jim?
Yeah. There's one good example I can think of, certainly, Tom, is that he used to have this wild cow, and I remember often chasing around fields after her because I'd get the job of bringing her back when she'd break out, and she broke out often. But he used to say, when she'd be roaring, he'd say, Jesus, you'd hear her on the down her. And I always wondered, what was that, but it was only years later I discovered it was on down here, the Eastern world. And Jim would have used a lot of Irish words, even though he wasn't an Irish speaker. He had them from, his own background and his own people, I suppose, as they spoke them. And there were many like that he would have used. And as I said, just mannerisms, the way he understood the place, really, really important for me. But I've met many people now as an oral historian, and many of them become great, great friends of mine. And, I still, even though I work, as I say, in terms of the level of oral history has increased, and I work at fairly high level projects and stuff, but it all, and in terms of history, whatever books I've written, it all comes back to that simple understanding of people and place. And I don't ever believe, and I've said this publicly, that you need to, there's a false correlation between like traveling and broadening the mind. And I think you can travel and broaden your mind, but you can stay in the one place and broaden your mind if you understand the richness that's there. Like Paddy Kavanagh said once that it takes a long life to understand the corner of a field. And I believe that, and it's a failure that people who aren't able to read their own landscape and understand the richness that's all around them. And they're the kind of things that has led the work I've done, both in history and in, we'll say, professionally as such.
What did he work at, Tom?
Just a farmer. Just a farmer. I mean, I don't mean it in that sense, but he farmed all his life. He was a great horseman, a great, great horseman. And I know even when he died in 1997 at the age of 99. Sorry, 2007, 99. And I was 27 at the time, or 26. But I know up until even, he was very active up until, his mid-90s. And I remember working with him, and he was outdoing me every day, like in his work, like a fierce, strong, physically strong man. But I know people used to come up from places like Scariff or Whitegate with horses and get Jim to train him. I remember seeing him training horses, blowing his own place. Dogs, he could train dogs as well. And again, that was all just inherited, practiced knowledge. But a remarkable man.
Two things. First of all, just a smart comment. I made dancing costumes for O'Callaghan's Mills.
Is that right?
I set dancing costumes.
Wow, yeah.
For what's his name? Tony Taffy. He does the
Hurries
now.
Are over. Yeah, that's right.
He does the Hurries now. He was a fair set dancer himself.
Yeah, the Torpies are there a long time over at Linwood side, and there would be there'd be a very significant site over there where the Linwood ambush took place actually as well, and the Torpies would be very connected in the memory of that. Yeah,
and the second thing is you kind of dismissed. Would I get the impression you were on about academics a minute ago there now? What were you saying about academics?
Yeah, it's not that I dismiss them. I mean, I like, some people could call me an academic. I mean, I have a PhD and I lecture in universities from time to time.
Oh, hold on, Tom, don't even listen to that now. We're kind of outside this now. We are. We haven't any PhDs. Go ahead, Thomas.
Well, the PhD doesn't matter. It's only 3 letters, so it doesn't.
Tom Mac didn't have a PhD either.
Well, look, the what I've learned over time is that, as I said about Jim, that for me, whenever I decided to pursue the PhD, it was my PhD, I should say, was on the social memory of the Irish War of Independence. And I always, since I was very, very young, had a view of the value of that memory and the need to explore it from the ground up. And I suppose it was almost a personal challenge, because I used to see memory and oral history constantly dismissed by academia. And I suppose part of it was a kind of an ambition to prove the theory within that circle. And I don't spend a lot of time within universities. I lecture from time to time, but 95% of my work is outside in communities, which is where I'm far more comfortable. But I will say this though, and I forgot to say it about my younger life, when one of the most significant moments I had, which only kind of crystallized years later, I was coming home from school one day at about the age of 9 or 10. And I used to be, like I said before, picking up old objects and stuff. And I went into an old, not even a cottage, only the corner of an old stone built house. And, you know, the vegetative grass and bushes inside. And I was rooting around and found what turned out to be a revolver. And this would have been now maybe 1990 or so. And, you know, ran up home with it, you know, the revolver in my hand, certainly put it away with my museum that I was developing, and had it for a while. Now, either one or two things happened. My brother, who's over in New Zealand for the last nearly 20 years, took it and lost it. That's possible. Never admitted it. Or the other thing is, we'd how do I put this now? We have to be careful. People who would have traveled around the area would have stolen things from us from time to time, and that's a possible another place it went. But it just still destroys me to this day that it's gone, because when I look back now, it's the perfect metaphor for what I've been trying to talk about all my adult life, that in your own townland, wherever that may be, there is memory relating to that time. And that was a physical object connecting to the War of Independence that was buried in the townland. And I used that in the Time of the Tens book that I wrote. I talked about the need for us as historians to literally get down on our hands and knees in townlands and in places around the country to find the history that's there. So it turned out to be this kind of perfect metaphor, but at the time it was just a gun that I was excited about. But that's all happening now, lads, within the same space as Jim and my people, you know, so I didn't have to go outside my townland to see all of this memory playing out.
Where did it come from?
Well, you see, I know now, for example, all of the active IRA volunteers that were in that townland or in that area, and Cara Hurley, which would be a townland above us, would have been a very active IRA area, and would have been, Micheál Brennan would have stayed there on many, many occasions. So it would have been a quite active IRA area. I know, for example, of many stories that I've documented within that townland. There was a significant raid that took place where the RIC and Black and Tans combed the whole mountain towns area, including that townland. And I suspect, looking back on it now, it was hidden by an IRA volunteer who had every intention of coming back and ultimately didn't come back to collect it, because it certainly wasn't left there by a British, by a Black and Tan or an RIC man. You know, so I would say there's a John Dillon who would have been a senior figure in that area. It may well have been him, because not every IRA volunteer, again, or every IRA member would have had a gun to hide. So it was likely one of those people who left it behind them.
Can you ask me then, Thomas, that you said you're from Tumgraney?
That's right.
A Scariff.
Oh no, we better get that clear right now, Tom or Tony. That's very important to be clear about that. Tumgraney and Scariff are divided by a bridge and by water and by many, many other things. Now I'm from the village of Tumgraney. There's a lot of personal gripes that we have, because the secondary school, Scariff Secondary School, is inside in the middle of Tumgraney. Finsa Factory, in fact, is in Tumgraney, even though it was always called Finsa Factory in Scariff. But Bodyke and Tumgraney are connected by church, I suppose, but by hurling more importantly. It's Bodyke Hurling Club. I would have played with myself, and the evicted field is inside in the middle of Tumgraney as well. So a very, very proud Tumgraney man. But I will say this, that when I launched the book, The Scariff Martyrs, back last September, Scariff Hurling Club hosted the launch in the hurling field, and they could not have been better. And like I really owe them a great debt of gratitude, and they were very good to me and very good to the launch of the book, and they naturally are very emotionally connected to the story and proud of it. But certainly, as I say often, we were able to break down the bridges for that particular occasion back in September last year.
There were no hurleys taking up with that.
No hurleys taken up that evening. No, I think last time I played Scariff, I was sent off, so we were just as well, probably.
The GA tribes and such tribalism. I mean, even this week, the Clare Echo, one of these papers reported that the lotto was won in Killaloe, and they got loads of array correspondence.
Yeah. It's funny. It's funny. I see all that because I actually live in Killaloe now. And
Yeah.
like I'm speaking to you from Killaloe, and like
Yeah.
I'm very, even though I'm not from Killaloe, like I'd always be clarifying that too, like that I'm not in Ballina, because that's an even bigger divide because it's putting you into Prairie. But and you know, the funny thing about that lotto win was fairly deep into Ballina, like, you know, it's not even that was just across the bridge, but I think that might have been a marketing tool as much as everything else.
So my daughter lives in Ballina, and she gets that all the time, and they say, "Oh, you know, in County Clare," and like they automatically presume because it's Killaloe. And
sure.
There, But
we all know a certain man that lives in Ballina, and he refuses to say Killaloe. He says Ballina, County Tipperary.
Yeah.
He puts down.
But he's right. He's right. Yeah.
And he also gives out about the name of his house. He says it's Art Quilter. He says it should be Ardna Quilter.
All right.
No, he says it should be put in. But anyway, we move along. Now that brings us up to the book, Tomás, that I went to a lecture you gave in November out in the lakeside with the Killaloe Ballina Historical Society.
That's right, yeah.
And I found it
the
very
lakeside,
interesting now. So
the lakeside is in Ballina, Tony.
Sorry, Tom?
The lakeside is in Ballina, actually.
Oh, it is. They give the address as Killaloe as well. Anyway, the book, Tomás, first of all, the title of the book, why it was written, and then you can explain the contents of it.
No bother at all, Tony. So the title of the book is The Scariff Martyrs, War, Murder and Memory in East Clare. And, you know, the title would be very conscious in the sense that, of course, they're known as the Scariff Martyrs, 4 young men who were murdered on the bridge of Killaloe on the 16th of November, 1920. And I'll explain about them in a minute. But they're known most popularly as the Scariff Martyrs. But it's funny, in Killaloe, they're predominantly known as the 4 who fell. And in Ballina, they'd be known as the 4 who fell. And that comes from a song that was written. There's a famous song, the Christy Moore song, called the Scariff Martyrs. But there's another song in Killaloe that's written from the Killaloe context by a man called Jack Noonan in the late 50s. And that's called the 4 who fell. So that certainly has influenced the way people in Killaloe would refer to them. But as I say, more predominantly, they're known as the Scariff Martyrs. And the war, murder and memory is important because the book is as much a kind of an exploration of memory as it is the actual story itself, because I certainly have found across 17 years of research, I started this properly in 2004, even though I'd known of the story for many years, obviously before that. But it is one of the strongest stories in the context of the emotion and memory associated with it. We have the monuments, you have the songs, there are many songs about it.
Is the monument on the bridge now?
Yes, and I should explain that for anybody now who's travelling across the bridge, let's say from the Ballina side over to Killaloe, the monument is about 2/3 of the way across the bridge on the northern side and the right-hand side of the bridge, integrated into it. And I'm involved with the East Clare Memorial Committee for a lot of years, and we got it cleaned up for the 100th anniversary there in 2020. So why I wrote it was, I suppose, Tony, I had been, as I explained, interested in history for a long time. I'd been interested in the War of Independence. I suppose up until that point, I was 23 when I started. And, you know, maybe I suppose I had some sense maybe that the story was so well known that, you know, it didn't need to be considered. And I don't think when I started researching it, I don't think I could say to myself that I ever verbalized this, that I'm going to write a book about it. I was primarily focused on recording the memories. Like the first person I interviewed was a 99-year-old man at the time, Paddy Leeson, and I went on to record him up until the age of 106 when he died. And Paddy was at the funeral and he knew the men, and I recorded other people who knew them. So I was always focused on just recording the memory so it wouldn't be lost. But I suppose as I developed that, I started to kind of realize that there was an awful lot more to the story that, you know, I suppose not necessarily that people didn't know. Of course, there are aspects I discovered that people didn't know, but it was more that there were all these different parts of the story that people knew, but nobody had ever really put it together in a coherent body of work. And neither had anybody tried to explain why the story was so significant, why it's so strongly remembered, and what is the meaning of all of that. So I suppose that developed over time. And as I said, I spent 17 years at it, and I have a very strong belief in the need to spend a lot of time at that that type of research. I think going back to Kevina's description of being taken a long time to understand, a life to understand the corner of a field, you know, it takes a lot of time to understand history. And I've always had that strong belief, and I say it often, that there's a fundamental difference between, you know, somebody who can, you know, display a huge amount of knowledge or information or statistics about history, and somebody who can understand it. And you can have somebody who has, you know, all of the qualifications, all of the information, but you could have somebody looking over a field or a gate in a field who'd understand the thing better. And I suppose I always have that ambition to understand it. I don't know if I've achieved that, but that was the ambition with the Scarf Martyrs. I felt I needed to understand it in all its kind of nuances and complexities to be able to tell that story and get a sense of the emotion and the fear and the trauma of the whole thing.
You go back to the beginning, John. Sorry, Tom.
No, I remember Thomas, and myself and Tom Tummy discussed this. A guy who wrote a book, and he never visited the sites of where it happened. Like, Tom Tummy's a great believer, and I do too. Like, if you're reading about an ambush, go to the place and look at where it happened, because the landscape can tell the story. You know, a lot of the story. And Tony knows. Tom Tummy can pass a gatepost, and he can tell you who was shot there, or, you know, from traveling around the countryside. Like, I
spent an hour with him under the gate, I tell you. And I got confused in the end. I didn't know who was after shooting who, you know. But that's a story for another time, you know.
No,
but it is true. It is true. And he could tell me at that gate where the bullets came from, who shot whom, and, you know. And I was looking over the thing, and I was just saying, but I knew what he meant. You know, and I took a fair amount of it in.
He's so right. And I mean, I have huge respect for Tom, as Tom knows, and I've known Tom. He's a great friend of mine for a lot of years. And I take his advice, you know, anytime I'm sitting down with Tom and we have a cup of coffee, I listen, you know, and it's one of the things I've learned over the years, I suppose, is the value in listening, you know, when somebody's talking to you. And not just listening to reply, but listening to hear. And, you know, Tom spent years and decades writing his book, and I quoted and I refer to him often as an example, you know, one of the finest examples in the country of how you write a book and develop an understanding of how you write.
I think the best compliment I got, I was in Stokes bookshop in Dublin. It's a kind of an old bookshop, you know, antiquarian bookshop. And my wife came in with me. She wasn't looking at books more to accompany or anything, but I took down Tom Tummy's book from the top shelf, and I said to her, look what he has here. And Stokes interrupted me. He said, no, that's how you write a history book. He said, that book is one of the best books I've ever read. So to continue on that, Tom Tummy said to me that Tomás McNamara's book is the best book he's ever read. And I said to him, except for your book. And he said, no, including my book, he said, because he said, I can feel as if I'm in the ambush when I'm reading his book. And I think that's a tribute to your research with the people who had the memory, you know, the folk memory.
Well, look, that's a lovely compliment to get, Tom. And I think, you know, that's again a testament to the people I spoke to, because when you kind of tap into that memory and you tap into that tradition and feeling, you are able to communicate it back then to the public. And you know, that's not really a testament to me, it's just a testament to the people I interviewed. And you know, hopefully by letting them speak for themselves and conveying that sense, like, because I often think too, you know, we write about chronologies and we give accounts of the past, but like, you know, you can pass over in that way then the burning of a house without going into that house and getting a sense of what it was like for your house to be burned down around you by sometimes by British forces. You know, the level of pain and trauma and anger that creates, you can't just pass that off. You have to dwell on it.
But I mean, you can't get much more intimate, say, than your aunt who danced with one of the martyrs. You know what I mean?
That's exactly it. And I mean, that was really important, Tom, because like you're referring there to Michael Egan, who was one of the four men. And I should say, I suppose,
can I hold you there now? We're jumping away a minute now. Go back and start at the beginning, because we're jumping into Michael Egan now. Go back and start and explain what happened.
Well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll start at the end, right? And we'll go back to the beginning then, because what's important with the four men is they come together at the end of the story, really. The four men are Alfie Rogers, Michael Brod McMahon, Martin Gilday and Michael Egan, right? Now, Michael Egan is different in the sense that Michael wasn't an IRA volunteer. The other three were. Now, Michael was the caretaker of a house down in Whitegate known as Williamstown House, right? Just on the shore of Lough Derg in Whitegate. And in November 1920, around the start of November 1920, which, as we know, was a really, really violent time in Ireland, and the war had really escalated at that point. You know, Kevin Barry is hung on the 1st of November. Terence McSweeney had died only, you know, a couple of days before that. His funeral was the day before that. So, you know, the three IRA volunteers, McMahon, Rogers and Gilday, had been very active, and I'll explain that activity in a minute. But at that time, they arrived to Whitegate looking for shelter. Michael Egan decides to let them stay in Williamstown House, which was a large hunting lodge that he was caretaker for.
This is, sorry to interrupt you, this is a different house now from Williamstead.
It is, and that's important because people maybe in Limerick would know that house, Williamstead, as a place for weddings and stuff. It's very close to it. It's not far from it, but it's a different place.
Well, I was in Williamstown House now. Half of that is gone, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a portion of it left, but the portion that's
down
left,
at the edge of it. Actually, it was you weird that brought me there now, would you believe?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Oh, God, it must be 30 years ago. Anyway,
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead anyway.
No, that's fine. So on the 16th of November then, on that morning, the G Company of the Auxiliaries, who had been posted to Killaloe and stayed in the Lakeside Hotel, which we talked about, they left that hotel, they commandeered the SS Shannon and travelled by water down Lough Derg to Williamstown Pier, Williamstown Harbour, which was only 100 yards from the house. They clearly had been given information by a spy, which we'll come back to. They went into the house, they met Michael Egan first, and he tried to divert them and to claim there was no one there and tried to get rid of them. And they continued to search, discovered the three volunteers inside in one room, arrested them, arrested Michael Egan as well, took them back on board a boat, brought two Conway brothers as well, which was really critical afterwards in terms of information. But the first four men, Rogers, McMahon, Gilday and Michael Egan, were all tortured. They were brought back to the hotel, tortured for between 7 and 8 hours, and brought out to the bridge of Killaloe on the night of the 16th of November and were executed on the bridge that night. So that's what brought them together. Michael Egan didn't have any involvement in the IRA before that. I've been able to discover through oral tradition that he was a really timid, gentle type of a young man, nationalist, but not, you know, the type of man, I suppose, who could find himself involved in IRA activity. But he is known as one of the four Scariff martyrs now. They're brought together by their end rather than their lives, if that makes sense. But you mentioned about my grandmother there, Tom. My grandmother, Mary Hill, was 19 when she danced with Michael Egan, only in a couple of months before he was killed. And she spoke often over the years. I never met the woman, but she spoke to my mother and my uncle about how really quiet and timid and nervous type of young fella he was. And she'd fierce sympathy for him, of course. She'd sympathy for them all, but for Michael in particular, because he was so quiet and shy. And, you know, you imagine the fear he had going through all that.
Yeah.
So I suppose, maybe jump back, if that's okay now, and maybe kind of explain the background to it. Just to give a general synopsis of it. Rogers, McMahon and Gilday, you know, well-known men from the town of Scariff. Gilday himself was actually from Newen up near Loughrea in Galway. He had spent time working up in Kilcullen and Kildare in a shop. Lawrence Darby's shop up in Kilcullen, comes down to Scariff in 1916, gets employment with Denham Sparling, a well-known merchant, Protestant merchant in Scariff town, worked there as a shop hand and other duties. And during that time joins with the volunteers. He's an Irish dancer, well known for teaching Irish dancing in Scariff during that time. Alfie Rogers is from, again, a well-established business shop in Scariff town. The Rogers, they're still there. Young Mark Rogers, if you're watching your hurling, is playing hurling for Clare at the moment, and he's the great grandnephew of Alfie. Alfie went to school in Mungret College, where he was in school, for example, with Timothy Madigan and Christopher Lucy, who were both killed, like Alfie, within a month of each other in November and December 1920. Michael Brod McMahon then is, again, from a business in Scariff, from a hardware and public house, again, from a well-established, relatively well-off family. And that's interesting because, you know, most IRA volunteers didn't come from kind of relatively well-off families, but they did. And what's important to say is they were committed IRA men, but they were also very committed Irish language enthusiasts. And Brod McMahon would have been to the Carrigaholt Gaeltacht, and he would have been to the Waterford Gaeltacht. Real strong advocates. Alfie Rogers was too, so was Martin Gildea. All of them were Irish speakers. Tumgraney at the time had a very strong Irish language movement with Edward MacLysaght and Conor Clune and Padraig O'Kyle as well. So, you know, they were immersed in all of that cultural...
Sorry, Tom, this is Edward MacLysaght, who lived at Raheen.
Exactly right.
Who's done the books on Irish surnames and that.
Yeah, I mean, and again, from like I would have a huge respect for Edward MacLysaght, and he's somebody that should be known better than he is really in terms of the work he did. But he would have, for example, Brod McMahon was was a good friend of Edward MacLysaght, and his brother Dennis McMahon was actually his best friend, was MacLysaght's best friend. So he was intimately connected with all of this episode. But they remain involved from 1917. The Eastler by-election, De Valera's election as the Sinn Féin candidate was a really significant moment for East Clare, because it brought all of this activism for the first time in a public way, which was really critical, I think. And I wrote a book called Days of Hunger about the 1917 hunger strike, and that obviously discusses that East Clare campaign very, very strongly. And I think it was really important because really for you could say for centuries, but certainly for decades, republicanism was a thing of the underground, you know, and it had to be because of the nature of British repression, etc. But now, in 1917, not 1916, in 17, it becomes a public thing for the first time. And young people see this activism, they see this energy, and they gravitate to it. The Irish Parliamentary Party, you know, we're now being seen as this kind of conservative, boring sort of an alternative. Now you had this predominantly young Sinn Féin movement that was standing for something more energetic. So Rogers, McMahon and Gildea joined that. They joined the volunteers. By 1919, it's very clear they're very, very active men. They're involved. The three of them go to Galway with a Cumann activist and secure 5 service rifles and bring them back from Galway to the East Clare IRA, and they were badly, badly needed at that time. Like one service rifle in a company would be very significant, but to have 5 within your battalion areas shared out was really significant. So they were really men.
Did you ever source where the rifles came from?
Yeah, they were. Yeah, I have the name of the individual. It was actually a Catholic priest up in Loughrea who Annie Omara was the Conan Family activist, and she had a priest up in Loughrea, and he was able to secure them from a merchant in Portumna, I should say. No, I'm wrong again, Ballinasloe. So it was from a merchant in Ballinasloe. I don't know where that merchant got them. They could have been returned soldiers, but certainly it was the priest, the merchant, and Annie Omara. But the 3 lads went up and got the rifles and brought them back. Yeah, okay. So that really, I suppose, leads us into 1920, and that's the most significant time in the story, really, because you have really, while there's activism and all of the other like IRA or RIC barracks are attacked, really it's only in September 1920 that things kick off in areas like Scariff and Tumgraney, etc. Because at that time, on the 18th of September, Scariff RIC barracks is attacked by a very large unit of the East Clare IRA, including men from Newmarket or Callahan's Mills and Flagmount, the 6th Battalion, including Michael D. Higgins' uncle, Peter Higgins, was involved. There was bombs brought down from Dublin, etc. And the barracks is attacked. Now, it's a very heavily fortified barracks. All other barracks in North East Clare have been closed, and then the RIC and Black and Tans were now within that barracks. 2-story building, now where the Scariff Medical Centre would be. So the barracks is attacked. You have people like Martin, the neighbour, Mac, who was a former British soldier. You have Joe Clancy, another former British soldier, up on the roof, make a hole in the roof. In fairness to the RIC, they defend it very strongly. But what happens is that Rogers, McMahon and Gildea are critical to this. They're men from the town. They know it well. They set up the bases. They direct the IRA volunteers where to go, what house to go into, what window to shoot from. And they're seen by the RIC doing this. And that's the first time the RIC become aware of their activism, which was a remarkable feat. Alfie Rogers was a real kind of happy-go-lucky type of an individual. And he went into the RIC barracks the night before the attack. I got a tape recording from the 1980s from a volunteer who was involved, and he explained how Alfie was able to go into the barracks. He knew the RIC that well. He was pretending to be their friend. He went in talking to them and was able to survey, you know, what way the defenses were set up. So they then become wanted men from that night. The attack ultimately fails. The bombs that Joe Clancy was throwing down through the roof didn't detonate. The firing pin was too short, it seems, afterwards. But the RIC do retreat from the barracks back to Killaloe subsequent to that. So now that leaves Northeast Clare devoid of a regular police presence, which becomes important. But for 65 days after that event on the 18th of September, there's a dramatic escalation of activity. And just to kind of give a broad outline of it, the 25th of September, a week after the barracks attack, the Micheál Brennan, who will be known well to your listeners from Meelick, leads an IRA active service unit that includes the three men into Broadford, where they shoot, they attack the RIC and shoot Constable Michael Brennan dead, who is a constable from a place called Timon up in Galway, very close to where Martin Gildea was from, very close to where James Hogan, a very famous UCC professor of history, subsequently, he was involved in the IRA attack. He was from close to where Brogan was from. Brogan is shot dead. 4 days later in O'Brien's Bridge, Micheál Brennan again is very, very determined, it seems, to attack and take the fight to the take the fight to the RIC and the British forces. In O'Brien's Bridge, in Ryan's public house, they shoot dead, and this involves Rogers, McMahon and Gildea now. They shoot dead Constable John Downey and Constable John O'Keefe. And what's significant is that Downey had 11 days before that given in his notice to resign from the RIC. So in one sense, again, like all of these things, we have to have the capacity to stand back and you know, just reflect on things at a human level. And you know, there is of course sadness for the families of those men. They're as dead as anybody else, but with Downey, because he had already said he was going to leave the RIC, I suppose there's a certain poignance to that. But that's now the first 3 RIC men in East Clare have been killed within a couple of days. A week after that, the Fecal ambush takes place. Now, Brennan is injured during the O'Brien's Bridge attack. It's actually Martin Gildea, it seems, from my analysis, who shoots him in the arm by mistake in the shooting. So Brennan is now being taken care of in East Clare. And the Fecal IRA attack the RIC in Fecal and shoot dead Sergeant Francis Doherty and Constable William Stanley. So now 5 RIC have been killed in a matter of 2 weeks. At that stage, Rogers, McMahon and Gildea are on their own and they're in shelter, they're in hiding, okay? They're not involved in Fecal, but it just is another escalation of the conflict. On the 26th of October, 3 weeks later, a man called Martin Coonahan is shot dead on the allegation of being a spy. He's shot by the IRA in Fecal. Now, that was really significant in the sense that, you know, it's the first spy, of course, to be killed in East Clare. He dies, and I did a lot of work over the years on this in terms of the oral tradition. He dies very, very badly in the sense that whatever way they shot him, he survived, and he managed to crawl and walk for 2 miles into the village of Bodyke with his entrails effectively coming out of him, and dies in what was Noonan's public house at the time in Bodyke. And that was known all over East Clare. But what's really significant for the Scariff Martyrs is that despite that happening, 2 weeks later, they're captured on the information another spy gives to the British forces. So the role of spies in this time and the presence of them, omnipresence almost of them, is really, really significant. But that's the 26th of October. The lads are still on the run. They're still getting shelter in East Clare.
Sorry, Tomás, the first spy that was shot, the spy that was shot, what was the allegations what was the evidence he was shot on?
Well, I looked very carefully into that, and you know, I spent years trying to find his family, right? Because he had 9 children. He had a widow. He left a wife and 9 children behind him, and they all immigrated to America. And it took a lot of years. I think it was 2012. I eventually tracked down his grandson, who was a man in his 70s in America. And we developed a conversation, and it took a long time now for him to build up the trust in me. And he eventually opened up, and you know, he understood I was trying to get the story, and I was trying to be human about it. And I was also saying like that there's no understanding of the Conan family. And like, I understand as any other man, the danger of spies and the damage they did. But at the same time, like, the wife still was widowed, the children were still left without a father. So I wanted to hear their story. And as a result of that interaction, I got a photograph of the man, which is in the book. And that would be the first time he'd been seen for 100 years. And he clearly had a different version of it. He didn't believe his grandfather was a spy, but there is multiple sources of evidence that would indicate he was at the very, very least putting himself in serious danger. He was a process server, right? Civil bail officer. So that would put him in one particular position. But there is also the fact that, for example, in the confidential reports of the county inspector, he says that a man called Conan, who was friendly with police, was cruelly murdered. Now, saying somebody was friendly with police in November 1920 is significant, right? There's multiple other accounts from IRA volunteers who claimed that they had been aware that he had been spying. There was multiple raids done. He was seen in areas where the IRA were active. Suddenly the British forces would arrive. But most powerfully, there's a statement given to the British, or to the Bureau of Military History, by Thomas Toohey, who was involved in the execution of Conan. And he claims that Conan was actually very defiant towards the end, and that he refused to back down and said he'd continue to work against the IRA. And I have other evidence within oral tradition that was said as well by the IRA men involved. So I come to the conclusion in the book, and I'm very careful about it, but I come to the conclusion, Tom, that I think it's likely he was given information to the police. And as a result of that, he was executed. But it's really fascinating that 2 weeks later, despite how violent his death was, there were still people giving information. So at that time anyway, just to bring it along, that's the 26th of November. Remember, that's the day that Terence McSweeney dies in Brixton prison as well. So you're bringing the national with the local together. But in any case, the men at that time, I believe, are moving towards Whitegate, the three men now I'm talking about. And they come towards Williamstown House. The belief locally had always been, and I heard that for many years, that they became very careless. There were three young men, and I think they did. Right, for a time they became careless. They were going to house dances with the guns in the pockets, and they were walking around openly with weaponry, not being careful about their movements. McMahon and Rogers were coming into Scariff to look at their business books, etc. They had girlfriends, this type of thing. And I think you have to, again, at a human level, understand these are young men, right? And they are active IRA men, they're experienced men, in relatively speaking. But they're young men, and young men, have energy, and they've a bit of bravado, that type of thing. You also have to remember the RAC were gone from East Clare as a regular presence, so that would have emboldened the IRA. They were warned, but the belief always remained, and even from IRA men who wrote about it afterwards, they believed till they died that the men were being too careless. But I was able to discover, after years of research, that in the last week before they were captured, they had actually left the Whitegate area and they'd gone up to Galway to Martin Gilday's home place. Well, they ended up there. They were turned away from two different houses because people were afraid to keep them. They ended up in Martin Gilday's home place, 50 miles round trip, and were being spied on up there and had to turn right around and come back down. I found, and again in a recording, that they were in Gortini for a night, and they eventually made their way back down to Whitegate. And within a day, they were spotted again, and the information was sent back up to the Lakeside Hotel where the G Company, the auxiliaries were, and that then ultimately led to their eventual capture and their eventual death. And the death, I suppose, is always the key focus of the story, and it's the key focus of the song. But the death is, of course, it's an end and it's a beginning in some sense, and I try to portray that in the book, because you have the story, you have the history, but you also then have the memory, and I try and go into that very deeply and to get a sense of the pain suffered by the families. And I say this at the start of the book, like that the families, even though they're massively proud, the first emotion was pain, and overriding emotion was pain. Those families didn't want martyrs, and that's something we have to kind of understand, that they didn't want their sons to die. They didn't want martyrs, but the community is kind of different. The community more quickly kind of develops pride in the story. The family are proud. There's no family member that's ever suggested otherwise. But we have to recognise the trauma it affects on them. The British held the bodies for 2 days afterwards, refused to leave them up. That adds another wound on top of a wound. Eventually, the IRA managed to secure them and get them. Actually, Denham Sparling, that merchant I mentioned earlier, was key in releasing the body, getting the bodies released. And they brought them back to Scariff Churchyard, where they were buried, 4 of them together. The British forces arrived at the funeral, and the funeral then becomes another element in the story and another wound, because they start interfering, even trying to knock the pallbearers when they're carrying the coffin, this type of thing. And, you know, we've seen stuff, lads, like looking at the North and looking at Francie Hughes' funeral, for example, and we see the police, the RUC interfering, and the level of tension and emotion was there in Scariff. You know, and we have to kind of think of it in that way. And that type of stuff sears itself into the consciousness, you know, and the memory then takes over, and the commemoration and the desire to remember. The songs are written, the monuments are installed, the commemorations are held. It is by far the most commemorated event in the whole of Clare, in my experience and my research over the years. So, you know, this powerful blend of history and memory comes together in the story, and I try in as much as I can to kind of get into that fairly deeply in the book. I also go into the background, obviously, and the Badaik evictions and how that forms a layer for people of that time.
And forgive my obsession with Spies, but was there ever a record, or did anybody ever have a suspicion on who gave way on the four men on the night of the raid? The police obviously were acting on information.
Yeah, I deal with that very, very deeply in the book, Tom, and I bring it to as much of a conclusion as I can. And I discovered across my research that there were over 20 spies in East Clare of different forms, not all connected to this story, of course, but the fact that they were there. I come to the conclusion, and of course, you know, in the book it goes into much more detail, but I identified 3 local people who I identify as suspect A, B, and C. And in those 3, I made that decision years ago. Not that I wouldn't name the names of those people. And the reason being, in those 3 cases, you would have family members still there. And I reflected on it for a long time, lads. And, you know, I know historians would be saying, oh, name the names. But the families didn't spy on them, you know. And,
that's right,
you know, I didn't think there'd be much gained, you know, from naming them, but there'd be a lot of hurt. So, but I do deal with it in every level of detail that I can, and explain how it happened. But ultimately, there were 3 local people, I believe, who were given information to the police. I identify the one that I believe most strongly was the one who gave it away, and I explain as much as I can about the context.
Was there any repercussions afterwards?
Well, for that one particular individual, he was at one point taken up the mountain to be shot. But as I explain in the book, ironically, one of the spies was an IRA volunteer, and he intervened at that time and managed to change his comrades' minds. They clearly didn't know at the time that that man was given information to the British. So ironically, he was saved by another spy. And the third individual would not have been known by the local community at all that he was a spy. You know, he wouldn't have been known by anybody.
It's one of those items in the War of Independence that hasn't been dealt with for obvious reasons, and even 100 years later, as you mentioned there, you know, because the families weren't spies, it's unfair to paint the family because of one individual, you know. Yeah,
you know, you're completely right. And I mean, like, I did draw a line where if I found public records that were publicly available and somebody was named or alleged to be a spy, then of course I will reference that because it's publicly available. And, you know, I did think about that as well. But at the same time, you know, when it's publicly available and other people can see it, then, you know, you can deal with that. Now, in those cases, there wasn't any official record. Obviously, the police rarely kept records, or at least they're not accessible, that would say such a person, A, B, or C, was a spy. But as I said, I deal with the whole thing and the culture around spies, and the fact that, for example, the song, I eventually years ago got an original the original handwritten version of the Scariff Martyr song. It was written in England, and there's a verse in that song. I publish it in the book, but it's never been heard, and it was never sung. The song was sung, you know, for decades in houses all across East Clare and in Australia and England, but that verse was never sung because it was obviously you know, I won't say edited out, but I think people made the decision because it talks about the desire for the spy's flesh to fall off his bones, etc. So it really gives you a sense of the anger that was in the community for whoever was the spy. But I think ultimately, in some cases, then if there isn't an immediate reprisal, and of course the IRA executed lots of spies around the country, I think maybe, even though there have been suspicions over the years, I think some people just decided, right, leave it alone, just let it go, you know. But it's a fascinating part of the story, and I go into it, not just that story, but where the spy sits, you know.
But it's interesting. I think you said, like, the memorial on the bridge was put up during the Civil War. It's a very early memorial.
Yeah, November 1923, Tom. And I mean, Maru is a bit earlier, and Charleville, I think, is a little bit earlier, but one of the earliest in the country. And really remarkable that it went up that early and became really a centre of attraction in the town. And in 1938, I quote from the school's folklore scheme, because the school in Trumgraney makes reference, the kids in the school make reference to, we take off our hat and say a prayer for them 4 boys every time we pass the bridge. And people did do that. People did bless themselves. You know, I do it myself, but people did always do that in the past. So it becomes what, there was a French theorist called Pierre Nora who talked about the lieu de mémoire, or the place of memory, and it became that. So the monument brings another function to the bridge almost as a place of memory.
Yeah. And it overshadowed the Renine ambush, didn't it?
It was interesting, Tom, because like the Renine ambush happens between the attack on the barracks in Scariff and the attack in Broadford. And I think in some ways that, you know, the Micheál Brennan's determination kind of increases after Renine, because he's at loggerheads with the leaders of the Mid-Clare Brigade. It's the most significant ambush that takes place in the country up until that time, 6 RAC and Black and Tans killed. And I think Brennan kind of intensifies things in East Clare. Now, to be fair, militarily, from a strategic point of view, IRA units were supposed to keep action in their area, because if there's no action in East Clare, then the British forces can gravitate to Mid-Clare and vice versa. So, you know, it made sense from that point of view. But I do think there was a correlation between Renine's success and the intensification in East Clare, because it all kicks off after that.
It's interesting around the country, like where there was rivalry and sometimes it became into hostility between different, you know, brigades. It
was very bitter in Clare. Dick Mulcahy wrote one time that if the IRA in East Clare and Mid Clare spent as much time fighting the enemy as they did each other, we'd have the war won by now. So there was something in that. I mean, I think it's fascinating. Just something I often said I must do a study on it, but again, time is not my friend. But like the Brennans were 3 Brennan brothers, were very active senior IRA leaders, and the Barretts were 7 brothers who were very active IRA leaders. So even that dynamic of brothers being leaders of...
Where were they, the Barretts? Where?
They were in a place called Dara in Lissycasey.
Oh, I know Dara,
They're very significant figures now. I mean, Sylvester Barrett, you know, who was a TD subsequently, would be a nephew, you know, of them. But, you know, Frank Barrett was the leader of the Mid-Clare, a very significant figure, took the anti-treaty side, of course, and most of the Mid-Clare Brigade took the anti-treaty side. Most of the East Clare Brigade took the pro-treaty side. But you can see how they follow the leader in that sense to a degree in that case.
Also, Renine, explain what Renine is.
Yeah, Renine is an ambush that took place on the 18th of September, 1920. And again, very significant. Funnily enough, I mentioned the Barretts, they actually weren't involved in the attack, even though, you know, it was led by people like Ignatius O'Neill, who was a former Canadian soldier, and Padre O'Loughlin and others up there as well. So a really significant ambush. They had done their planning. It took place between the towns of Lahinch and Milltown Malbay. A very good site for an ambush. There's a monument there now to it. It was put up in 56. And what happened actually was that the Second Royal Scots left in Estein and were travelling out to West Clare. The reason they were travelling out to West Clare is that a man called Captain Alan Lindrum had been shot dead that day in Dunbeg, further back into West Clare, not far from where the Trump Hotel is now, for example. Now, it turned out that was, I won't say an accident. They held up, he was a justice, and they held him up they held him up. He was driving a car, and it seems he put his hand down to pull up the handbrake, and one of the IRA lads thought he was pulling the gun, and they shot him dead. So the British, the Second Royal Scots military now, not Tans or auxiliaries, military, were leaving Ennistimon to head to West Clare, and they passed by, and the ambush didn't happen. There was a bit of a mix-up, but when they were on their way back, the ambush did take place. And, you know, again, very successful ambush from the IRA's point of view. Shot the 6 dead. One of them escaped, and they followed him and shot him dead. 2 of the IRA were wounded, but all of them managed to get away. And what happened was a reinforcement of military arrived on the scene subsequent to the actual action, and they were on their way as well back out to West Clare, to Dunbeg, and they're developed in a rearguard action. And the IRA, in fairness to them, were able to actually successfully deal with that rearguard action and make their way into the mountains and make their way into the landscape and survived. No IRA man was killed. Now, that night, the British military, Black and Tans and RIC burned down the towns of Ennistimon, Lahinch and Milltown Malbay. 6 people were killed in that surrounding violence. Many of them burned to death, some shot. Pat Lehan, who was actually involved in the ambush, was burned to death because he was hiding upstairs in a house in Lahinch, and they burned the house around him, and he was found burned to death in front of the door, or inside the door, the following morning. That same night, his father was shot in the neck because they went out to his house because Pack and his brother Donald were involved, and they went out looking to find out where they were. And of course, their father wouldn't tell him, and they shot him in the neck, and he died a couple of weeks later. So it was a night of huge violence. 12 people killed in the space of, you know, about 12 hours. So it was really a seminal moment. Tom Knoll, I talk about this actually, I should say, in my book, The Time of the Tens, and I spoke to the niece of Tom Knoll many times, and she talked about that and the devastation of it. Like, Tom Knoll now was a 31-year-old member of the ITGWU, and he wasn't involved in the IRA at all. His brother was, but they arrived at his house, pulled him out. His wife was there with their 2 children, 2 years old and 6 months. They pulled him up the road, and they set the house on fire, shot Tom, and threw him into the burning house. He was found there on the doorstep the following day. So real savage violence. But I think in East Clare, as I said, it kicks off the East Clare sort of side of the fight after that took place.
Tom, Tomás, you mentioned your books there. We just run through the books you've done to date.
No bother at all. Yeah. Well, look, the first guy and the revolutionary period, the 3 main books I've written are Days of Hunger, which is the Mountjoy Hunger Strike. It's called Days of Hunger, the Clare Volunteers and the Mountjoy Hunger Strike of 1917. And that, I suppose, just focuses on, that period of 1917. There were 32 men on that hunger strike. This is, of course, the one where Tomás Ashe dies 5 days into the hunger strike from forced feeding. But there's actually 16 Claremen on that hunger strike. And they were very much, the Brennans are on it, Micheál, Paddy and Aston. And they're very much leading that charge at that time. So I moved through the whole of 1917 and the development of Republican politics throughout the country, and particularly, obviously, the Clare role. I also deal with the whole history and mythology around hunger striking and why it had such an impact. Excuse me. It's the same in terms of Milltown Cemetery. People still continue to visit Bobby Sands' grave all the time. And I make the argument that Ashe's death, I actually make the argument in this, and I still stand over it, that Ashe's death had more of an impact on the consolidation of Republican politics in Ireland than the Easter Rising of 1916. And I say that because when Ashe's death happens, the Irish population have become much more in tune with Republican politics. They're much more supportive of it. And now a young man is force-fed to death. So you look at the impact in terms of membership and in terms of activism after 1917 versus after 1916. It's a far different affair. And it's been overlooked, I think, because it kind of sits between the 1916 Rising and the War of Independence. So that's that book. And then I suppose the next one I published was called The Time of the Tens, which is an oral history of the War of Independence. And that's based, again, on the interviews I've been doing across the years. And, obviously, again, as a book, I put a lot of years and a lot of time into, but it's focused very much on the memories and the significance of those stories. And I suppose the interplay between the memory and the history and the stories that I record and how they connect in with the historical events and that. So that was published in 2019. And then this the most recent one, of course, Scarf Martyrs. I published a few other books outside of that. I did a small book on the 1914 Clare hurling campaign when we won our first All-Ireland, and junior and senior actually the same year. I did a book on that, and I've written a few other. I wrote a book on an autograph book that Paddy Brennan had in Frongo internment camp, where I went through all the autographs that were, contributed by different people in Frongo and their background. And then I did as a kind of a different subject altogether. I wrote a small book now on the orthopedic hospital in Cork, because I do work in Cork in the Cork Folklore Project it's one of my projects, and I was asked by the HSE to do an oral history of that, which I did, and then I published a small book on the memory of that.
It's not all bullets and murderers.
Oh Jesus! I'll tell you, like I still love it, but I nearly would like to move out of it now for a while.
It's amazing
from bullets.
It's amazing you can get pigeonholed sometimes,
You can, but I mean, I don't mind,
The
other thing I suppose is that I've worked all over the country, and I mean, I'm a very, very proud Clare man, and I've done a lot of work in Clare, but obviously, people then sometimes don't realise that you've done an awful lot of work all over the country on different things, and that's fine too. Like, I mean, there's worse things than being pigeonholed as a Clare man.
Oh yeah.
Tomás, on behalf of myself and Tom and the Limerick Historical Society, can we thank you for coming on?
Oh, well, you can, and I'm very, very grateful myself, lads. And I'd encourage anyone, if you are interested in buying the book, go down, and the Time of the Tanzas and the Days of Hunger, actually, go down there to the Celtic Bookshop, to Pat O'Brien.
Yeah, you're going to say what Pat O'Brien had there.
It's in other bookshops, but I certainly, if I may, I'd encourage people to go down to Pat and buy it there.
Yes. I would too, always, because if anybody wants to get in contact with me or Tom anyway, I will tell them,
No bother, absolutely,
It sold very well anyway, I know that much,
I don't mind. I'm happy enough to let the publishers deal with all that. I'm just happy that people are get it and they appreciate it. And
well, I suppose the Celtic Bookshop is a good run by Clare people, and it's in Limerick. Right.
We
felt
you needed a bit of civilization, so we said we'd come in and we can help you out.
Anyway, I think, can we thank you anyway, Tomás, for coming on tonight?
You're very welcome, lads, and thanks a million for inviting me.
And we'll talk to you again another time, okay?
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
Anytime.
Okay, good job.
Very good.